out of every article that I've read in this year regarding South Africa, if I could choose two to sum up what's happening in South Africa and the circumstances in the country, it would be these two articles. And these two articles have really had me thinking over the last couple of days. You know, there's a narrative that certain organizations have been pushing in the public for years now, and I think more so recently, that the only reason why South Africa is struggling the way that it is, the only reason why we don't have enough jobs, why crime is such a major problem, why government is struggling the way that it is because we need more free markets, we need more privatization, and we need more investment, foreign investment. That if those things start being plugged into the country, if we start changing these things, everything else will just fall into place. Your areas will be safer. Your kids will receive a better education and they will have more opportunities. Your jobs will maybe pay you better. And so this is what I want to unpack. But let's just look at the first article. So the first one speaks about the stock market in South Africa. And it talks about how the stock market has outperformed expectations. And already when I read that, I think that the title of that article struck me, because I was like, with everything that South Africa's gone through in this year, how's the JSE, how are the companies listed on the JSE, how's the stock market doing so well, outperforming? But these were some of the main points in that article. Number one, the JSE passed the 100,000 mark for the first time in its history in July of 2025. And by the middle of October, that number reached 111,000. Now, what does that mean? What is that? Is that shares? Is that profit? Is that what? That 100,000 mark is kind of like a measurement that measures the overall average value, I speak under correction, of all of these companies that are listed on the JSE. And when that number goes up, it means that the value of the shares in all of these companies have increased. So we've reached a new record high. The second point was that the total equity or the total value of shares on the JSE in this year has increased by 30%. That is a huge jump. And that is where we see that real outperformance of expectations. So in other words, those who have invested in, many of whom, not all, but many of whom are foreign investors, are very happy with what they're seeing. They've pumped their money in, and let's make an example. Let's make a very simple example. Let's say they put in 1,000 Rand. From that 1,000 Rand, now with this 30% increase in the value of shares, they would now have 1,300 Rand. Or let's use a more realistic number. Let's say that they invested 10 million Rand. That investment would now be worth 13 million Rand. The value of the shares would have gone up by 3 million. My question is, and I'll answer this later on, how much of that 3 million reaches you? Then also corporate earnings. Companies that are listed on the JSE made over 20% increase in profits in this year. And that, considering the very uncertain times that we are living in. Think about everything that's happened in South Africa recently. We had the white genocide situation. We had Trump cutting off funds to NPOs and NGOs in South Africa. We had the tariff wars that's still ongoing. And yet now we are reading these articles telling us that companies in South Africa have outperformed in these conditions. The fourth point talks about bonds and how nominal bonds have delivered these 14% returns. That sounds like somebody is making 14% on these bonds. Now, number one, what are these bonds? These bonds are when companies, corporates, or even government basically issue an IOU, They say, I need some money. You give it to me as an investor, foreign investor probably, and I'm going to pay you back with interest. Early on in this year, I made a couple of videos about euro bonds, and this for me was a discovery. I'd never heard of it before. But basically, what euro bonds are is when, and this is just in my simple understanding, that it's when a company or even a government needs money and they can get it from these financial institutions or these companies overseas, but they will get the money in a foreign currency. That institution will not have to buy rands to give us rands. They will give it to us in euros or yuan or won, whatever it might be. Now, funny enough, South Africa, I believe, was the very first African country to issue out one of these IOUs, to issue out one of these Eurobonds almost immediately after 1994. And what these Eurobonds do, or what this debt does to a country, is it eats into public funds. Where do you think the South African government would get the money from to pay back these institutions? It's got to come from you, from your tax. And so instead of money going into public health, education, infrastructure, state-owned enterprises, a lot of that money has to go to pay back those loans. So now in a country like South Africa, we are not only dealing with the corruption that's stealing hundreds of millions, billions of rands, but we are also dealing with the sovereign debt that we owe to these other institutions. But what also becomes a problem is that this now becomes a cycle. Because now if you are dealing with the corruption and you are paying these institutions, how do you stay afloat? So you get into the cycle of needing more and more of these loans. And this eats deeper and deeper into the public funds. And that ends up pushing governments into privatization, because now you have to choose between, do I hold on to these state-owned companies, these SA Airways, these Escoms, and so on and so forth, knowing that I'm struggling to make these payments, or do I cut the loss, privatize those institutions so that I can spend more money on paying off those loans and maybe more money in some of those other areas that I should be taking care of? But when we read this article, it's telling us that those bonds saw an awesome return of 14%. But some of that money cuts into your public funds, and another portion of that money actually never reaches you. It has no impact on improving your life in any way at all. And then the last one, which I thought was very interesting, was investor optimism. It tells us that investors who are looking to keep their money in the South African Stock Exchange for the long term are going to see some really positive returns. Long term, things are looking good for investors. And that's so different from the information that some of these organizations keep giving us. They keep telling us that these foreign companies are afraid to invest in South Africa because of what's happening in the country. And yeah, maybe there is a certain legitimate fear for some of the things that are happening in our country. But clearly the performance in this year, with everything that we've been dealing with, is telling a very different story. And this is where I want to get into that second article. So after reading this first one, I kept asking myself, man, how does this make sense? How are we seeing companies doing so well on the JSE? And I think it's also important, let me also just say, that I understand that this doesn't include companies that are not on the JSE. So this doesn't speak for the performance of those companies. But this does speak for the companies that have the greatest and largest investments. Companies that are making the most money. Companies who probably have the largest number of employees. And companies that have the greatest influence on the economy and on the salaries of millions of South Africans. So let's look at that second article. The second article speaks about what South Africans should expect going into the festive season. And it really starts off by painting this bleak image of what that is going to be like. It describes how people are going to be sorely disappointed and disillusioned by this festive season. And that for many South Africans, going into December, going into Christmas, there's not going to be much for people to celebrate. The main points that they discussed there, number one, is the unemployment rate, and that is sitting at about 33.2% at the moment, which means that 1 out of 3 adults don't have a job. Now, mind you, when you're calculating unemployment, you are only calculating those people who are actively looking for work and not finding it and are currently unemployed. That does not include those who are not even looking for work at all. Then added to that is the ridiculous low wages that South Africans are living off of. It tells us that the average general worker is earning between about 4,800 to 5,600 Rand a month, which are numbers that I have been talking about this entire year. And for many middle-class South Africans who are earning anything over 8,000 Rand a month, that's difficult to understand. It's difficult to comprehend that the majority of people in your country are going home with these numbers, if not lower than that. I remember the specific article I read where it spoke about how 50% of South Africans go home with 1,500 Rand a month or less. That's absolutely insane. And the one time that I really understood this was when I came home in January of this year. You come from a first world country where the average citizen earns a decent wage, which is roughly around $9 to $10 an hour, where everybody lives in a house. There are no shacks. There are no townships. There are no Cape Flats. Every apartment has underfloor heating. Every apartment and home has electricity all the time. You live in a safe country where crime is almost non-existent. And even if you live in a rural town like I do, you constantly see developments happening to the infrastructure around you. And then you go back home and you land at OR Tambo and you start driving home. And all of a sudden, the things that you never really paid attention to before are now standing out like a sore thumb. You see that 4,000 and 5,000 Rand a month walking on the sidewalks down every street. You see the mismanagement and the poor maintenance of the infrastructure everywhere. There's something broken on every highway. If it's not potholes, then it's robots that have been hit through accidents that have still not been repaired, or side barriers that have been hit in accidents that have still not been repaired. It's waste and dirt piled up on the side of the roads that's never cleaned up. But to really comprehend what it's like for these families who are going home with around 4,000 to 5,000 Rand a month, keep in mind that the average grocery basket costs you around 3,800 Rand a month. That's before your rent, that's before your transport to and from work, and that's before your electricity. And yes, for many of the working class who are going home with that amount of money, they are usually on these so-called lifeline tariff tiers, where they don't pay what you and I might pay for, rates and water and electricity. And so there are a lot of the middle class who are angry at the working class who get a free ride in their minds, not realizing that if we had a more educated, higher earning working class, that wouldn't have to be a problem for you. You wouldn't have to feel like you are carrying their weight, which is a ridiculous notion anyway, but nevertheless. Then the last 3 points are the high cost of living, retrenchments and closures of mines and factories that's happened throughout this year, which means more and more people have lost jobs. In the Western Cape, let's not forget the 2,400 teachers' posts that were closed. And then there's the growing hunger and inequality. In that article, it spoke about absolute poverty. Like that's the worst stage of poverty that you can reach. In fact, for many of us as South Africans, we never see this in headlines, but do you know that there are thousands of children in our country who die of starvation, who die of malnutrition? But I think that this article, both of them, when you look at them in context and you understand the dynamics of what's happening in the country, that you have these two articles that are almost speaking about two completely different worlds in the same country, where on the one hand, investors making millions, many of them not even in our country, are smiling, are seeing increases. are seeing unexpected profits, unexpected returns. And on the other hand, you have the everyday South Africans who are not seeing and living that same reality, who are arguably living the complete opposite. And I think the lesson out of this needs to teach us that these organizations who are making promises to us that foreign investment is the answer, solely the answer, that privatization is the answer, may not be telling us the full story. This is telling us that these investors who are pumping in money into the economy don't really need you to change at all. They don't need your life to develop and improve at all. In fact, your life can get worse and they can still improve. So how much truth is behind that narrative? And to maybe summarize how the system works, how it's possible for these two worlds to exist at the same time, it's to understand that this money that goes into South Africa doesn't go into South Africa. This money, these investments go through South Africa. They don't reach you. But these narratives will tell you that the money trickles down and it impacts your life. How much has your life improved in this year? How many of you probably don't work for companies? Perhaps you don't even know that you are working for companies that are listed on the JSE because you are working for one of their subsidiaries, one of their smaller umbrella companies, and your salary is being frozen, or you have been retrenched, or your partner has lost their job, or you've been unemployed since COVID. So if these foreign investments, and it's possible that this can be done, that if these investments actually have purpose, meaning that they directly go into improving the quality of life of the average South African, then we can say, yes, investment can work. Meaning that those investments turn into higher taxes in the country, and that those taxes get pushed into education, healthcare, transport, infrastructure. And again, these things are possible. That is how countries like China and Singapore have become what they are. And you'll hear some of these narratives. You'll hear it from people like Rob Hersov, who will call China a communist country. China stopped being a communist country decades ago. They went through that phase. They are a capitalist country that is driven on production and investment into human development. Their people are their greatest asset. Their people are the engineers, the architects, and the designers who produce the technology that allows their citizens to live the way that they do today. And the same goes for Singapore. When Singapore was kicked out of the Federation of Malaysia, they needed to find a way to stand on their own 2 feet. And their strategy was to open themselves up to foreign investment, but to drive that investment into human development, into schools, subsidizing education, training and upskilling their citizens, and creating a population that brings value to the development of your economy and your entire nation. And South Africa just has not done that. And I think to close off, I want to point out that we also often hear, we point fingers at government only. The narrative in the news, the narrative on social media, and I think I've also contributed to this a lot myself, is that it's always only government. I think mainstream media, which is largely controlled by these major corporations, intentionally make sure that the headlines are articles that are going to rile you up emotionally about the state of your country and get you pointing fingers in the wrong places, or get you focusing on only one aspect of what's wrong with the country. So I think, number one, while we discuss the headlines, let us not also forget to look into those stories that are also published, that are right there. It's available for you and me to look into. That we look into those stories that don't really make the headlines, speaking about what's happening in the economy of our country in the background, and understanding what businesses are doing in our country and how those decisions are impacting you and me. And then secondly, it's for those who are blindly accepting these narratives and promises of organizations and political parties who are telling you that there's only one solution: free markets, privatization, and foreign investment. This video should have helped you to now understand how the economy can survive without your life ever changing. And that if you believe that foreign investment is part of the solution, that you demand that that foreign investment be used in a way that impacts and improves the quality of life of every South African and not just a select few. On that note, for all of you who've gotten to this point, I want to thank you, and I'll ask you to please don't forget to like, to subscribe, and to hit that notification bell. Also, I've just started a membership program on my YouTube channel, which means that you can now support the content that I make. And this is really important, because if you believe that the conversations that we have and the message that I am trying to teach is of value, not just to you, but to your community, to your kids, to our society at large, it's not something that I can just do on my own. And as always, I'll catch you in the next video.